A flight attendant flushed a baby's bottle, but the father's swift legal action left the entire airline stunned. A flight attendant flushed the baby's bottle, thinking no one would hold him accountable. He didn't realize the father was ready to turn the act into a legal storm. The moment the bottle disappeared, the cabin's power dynamics flipped. Subscribe. If you believe arrogance collapses the instant true authority rises. The sound of metal hinges groaned faintly as Darian Kelvon stepped off the jet bridge and onto Orlean Flight 772. His 8-month-old son, Laron, nestled calmly in his left arm, the soft thump of their boarding bag echoing behind him. A faint shift in the cabin pressure followed, but Darian didn't flinch. He was used to adapting under pressure. In his right hand, he carried a small, insulated baby bottle. Half-filled, slightly warm, its contents meant to keep Laren fed until they reached Varenport, where an important investor meeting awaited. That bottle represented more than formula. It was part of the pediatric tech project Darian was building, technology designed to make infant care smarter, safer. Every detail mattered. Every step was a calculated move toward a future he was crafting for Laron, and for other parents like him. "Good morning," Darian said quietly to the male flight attendant near the door, his voice steady, polite. Merrick Doss didn't answer. Instead, the man cast a fleeting glance at Laron, then down at the bottle in Darian's hand. His lips twitched into something that might have been mistaken for a smile, if not for the tension behind his eyes. Merrick's face held an expression like he was being asked to tolerate something beneath him. Darian caught the look, but said nothing. He adjusted the hood of Laron's blanket and moved forward, searching for their assigned seats. A few passengers turned their heads as he passed. A tall man carrying a baby tends to draw attention, but Darian kept his focus tight, letting the rhythm of the aisle guide him toward row 14. He settled into the window seat, securing Laron's small support pillow and setting the bottle carefully in the cup holder. The cabin smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and recycled air. A man across the aisle, gray blazer, gold watch, nodded politely. Darian nodded back. "Rough morning?" the man asked in a low tone, gesturing toward the cabin. Darian offered a small smile. Delayed takeoff, turbulence forecast, and now a meeting on the line. "Good luck," the man said, returning to his tablet. From the galley, a sharp click, click, click sound repeated, the rhythmic tap of a pen hitting a metal cart. Merrick again. His face was impassive, but the tapping was relentless, echoing just enough to be noticed. It wasn't loud, but it was pointed, like a slow countdown to something unspoken. Darian watched him from the corner of his eye. The man's movements were clipped, his manner too precise, as though the routine of service irritated him. Every task looked like an obligation he resented. A subtle tension began to spread in Darian's chest. Not panic, not fear, awareness. He returned to his notes on the tablet, reviewing pitch lines and product features for the Varenport presentation. The pediatric tech platform was modeled on biometric feedback sensors he'd tested at home with Laron, tiny wristbands that could detect changes in hydration, alert parents to feeding needs. It had taken months to build trust with investors. This meeting mattered. He glanced at his son, who gurgled softly in sleep. Everything he was building began here, with him. Another sharp click. Darian looked up again. Merrick was moving down the aisle now, checking luggage bins with a scowl that seemed to deepen at each row. The two men from earlier, mid-30s, business attire, were whispering to each other in row 11. As Darian adjusted Laron's blanket again, he caught one sentence. "That's the same guy who snapped at that old man this morning, said he was delaying the entire process. Real temper." The other replied, "Must hate this job." Neither of them noticed Darian listening, but he logged the comment, noted it like a timestamp in his mind. A tremor rocked the cabin as the plane jolted slightly. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and clipped. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a short delay due to a timing issue on the tarmac. Estimated takeoff in 15 minutes. Please remain seated. A few groans. A sigh from someone in row 17. Laron stirred. Darian held him closer. Merrick walked by again. This time his eyes didn't skim. They locked on the bottle. Just for a second. Then he looked away, but his jaw had tightened. It wasn't curiosity. It was something else. Disapproval? Contempt? The kind of look someone gives to a symbol of something they personally object to. Darian frowned. The bottle wasn't leaking. It was sealed. Nothing about it could be out of regulation. He picked it up, examined it just to be sure, and returned it to the cup holder. Laron shifted again, waking with a soft noise, his tiny hands curling toward his father's chest. "You're all right," Darian whispered, kissing the child's forehead. "Just a little longer." The bottle wasn't drawing attention because it was a safety issue. Darian sensed it, an instinct refined from years of boardrooms and conflict. Merrick wasn't following protocol. He was fixated. The pen tapping, the glances, the body language, it all built a silent picture. And only Darian seemed to see it. The overhead lights dimmed briefly as turbulence warnings flashed across a nearby monitor. The plane still hadn't taken off, and a mild hum from the engines underscored the passengers' increasing discomfort. Merrick appeared again. This time, he didn't tap his pen. He stood halfway down the aisle, staring at Darian and Laron. The look wasn't subtle now. It wasn't masked behind a smile. It was the kind of stare that asked a question without words. "Why are you here, and how long are you going to be a problem?" Darian stared back, calm and unwavering. The bottle rested silently beside him. Neither of them spoke, but something had already started. A quiet threat, a shift in the current, an unspoken decision made by a man whose authority didn't match his self-control. Darian turned away first, choosing his son over the conflict for now. But something told him this wouldn't be the end of it. He adjusted Laron's blanket, whispering again. "A calm journey can turn uncertain when the smallest object draws the wrong attention." As the plane leveled off and the seatbelt signs dimmed to a soft blue, Darian Kelvon looked down to check on his infant son. Laron stirred gently in his arms, the rhythmic hum of the engines blending with the low murmur of conversation in the cabin. Darian adjusted the baby's blanket, his attention momentarily drawn to the faint vibration of the plane. Everything seemed to settle until he saw the approach. Flight Attendant Merrick Doss walked briskly down the aisle, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes sharp and probing. Without greeting or preamble, he halted at Darian's row and leaned in slightly, too close for comfort. "Is that bottle filled with approved liquids?" Merrick asked, voice flat but laced with something beneath the surface. Accusation, perhaps, or annoyance barely restrained. Darian met his gaze calmly. "It's baby formula," he answered, nodding toward the bottle in the cup holder. "Prepared earlier. My son just finished a small portion." Merrick didn't move. His eyes flicked from the bottle to Laron, then back to Darian, narrowing slightly. "It's not sealed," he noted coldly. "No," Darian replied evenly. "I opened it during boarding so my son could feed. It's still warm." Passengers nearby began to notice the interaction. Some looked up from their tablets, others shifted in their seats, sensing something off in the tone. But they didn't know what had started to stir beneath the calm surface. Merrick straightened with mechanical stiffness. "Next time, make sure it stays sealed until requested," he said, turning sharply on his heel. Before Darian could respond, he heard a low mutter trailing behind the flight attendant. "People think they can bend rules just because they've got a baby." The words weren't meant to be heard, but they were. Darian's jaw tightened. He exhaled through his nose, slow and deliberate, choosing not to follow. His instincts told him this wasn't about protocol. A moment later, a voice came from across the aisle. "Watch him," the man said. Darian turned his head and saw a passenger, tall, mid-30s, dressed in a dark gray jacket and dress slacks, leaning forward slightly. "I'm Jaron Tyvek," the man added quietly. "I've flown with that guy before. He has a way of escalating things. Doesn't take much. I'd be careful." Darian gave a grateful nod. "Thanks for the heads up." "Just keep your cool," Jaron said, settling back in his seat. "Guys like that wait for a reaction." As Darian turned back to Laron, he couldn't ignore the rising tension. Something about Merrick's tone, his focus on the bottle, didn't feel procedural. It felt personal. And the way he'd looked at Darian, not just once but several times during boarding, hinted at a deeper irritation. There was more behind this than policy. A few minutes passed. The overhead lights dimmed slightly. A soft ding signaled the start of in-flight service preparations. Merrick reappeared, now pushing the beverage cart slowly down the aisle. But instead of interacting with passengers, he began slamming overhead bins shut. Loud, sharp movements that startled some and drew puzzled glances from others. Darian tracked each gesture. Merrick wasn't just closing bins. He was releasing something. Frustration, maybe, or anger, waiting for an outlet. Then he stopped again near Darian's row. He said nothing, just stared. The look wasn't one of concern. It was cold, calculated. Merrick's gaze dropped to the bottle still resting in the cup holder. His mouth tightened. The corners of his lips twitched, not a smile but something twisted beneath restraint. Darian stiffened. He gently bounced Laron on his shoulder, whispering something soft to soothe him, but his eyes remained locked on Merrick, who stood motionless for another second before continuing down the aisle, disappearing toward the rear of the aircraft. The atmosphere had changed. Darian sat back slowly, his mind shifting. This wasn't just about reaching Varenport anymore. His instincts, sharp from years in high-pressure business negotiations, were telling him something. This crew member had made a decision. Not one based on logic or policy, but something reactive, impulsive. He replayed the details. The question about the bottle, the fixation on whether it was sealed, the muttering, the slamming, the look. Whatever was about to happen, it would center on that bottle. The lights flickered once, briefly, barely noticeable but enough to send a ripple of awareness through the cabin. Then a brief bout of turbulence shook the aircraft. Not strong, but sudden. Darian's grip around his son tightened instinctively. He glanced at the bottle once more. It looked so harmless, just plastic, formula, warmth. And yet, it had drawn the wrong man's eye. Across the aisle, Jaron gave him a look of concern, mouthing a silent question. "You okay?" Darian nodded faintly. His mind, however, was no longer on his meeting, nor on the talking points he had reviewed before boarding. It was on preparation. Quiet, deliberate, mental preparation for an unpredictable encounter with a man who had already decided something. And that something, Darian knew, involved him and his son. He watched the rear of the plane, waiting, not afraid, but alert. The bottle had become the storm's center. Sometimes danger hides inside a moment so ordinary that no one recognizes the warning. Captain Larrick Halvin's voice cut through the rising din in the cabin. "Mr. Kelvon, if you'll come with me." His tone was respectful but urgent, shaped by the weight of command and concern. Darian, still cradling Laron securely against his chest, rose silently. The soft fussing of the infant, hungry and confused, added a somber undertone to every step he took down the narrow aisle. Several male passengers instinctively stood as well, their expressions resolute. These weren't just curious onlookers now, they were witnesses prepared to speak. They moved toward the front galley, the hum of the engines underscoring the strained silence as others parted to let them pass. Merrick Doss, standing rigid near the rear lavatory, watched them go with a flicker of indignation and a barely concealed sense of dread. He still clung to the belief that his authority could salvage the situation, unaware that his grip on control was unraveling with every witness who turned against him. Inside the galley, shielded from the main cabin noise, Captain Halvin turned to face Darien, his brows knit in concentration. "What happened?" he asked plainly. Darien's voice remained level, though the edge of urgency was impossible to miss. "My son's only feeding bottle was taken by your crew member and flushed. Leron hasn't eaten since before boarding. He's 8 months old. This isn't a minor issue. It's a medical concern." The captain's gaze dropped briefly to the infant's flushed cheeks and trembling lower lip, and something in his posture changed. A silent recognition passed between the two men. This wasn't a misunderstanding, and this wasn't overreaction. This was real harm. From behind them, Redden Corv stepped forward slowly, his voice low. "Captain, I should have intervened. I saw Merrick reach for the bottle. I hesitated." He swallowed. "It's not the first time he's done something like this." Lyric turned sharply. "Explain." Redden looked down, ashamed. 2 months ago, on Flight 918, similar situation. He confiscated a passenger's medication and claimed it violated personal fluid rules. The report was filed, but it got sealed. Supervisor Valst signed off and told us not to discuss it. Darien's expression didn't change, but inwardly, something clicked. This wasn't just an isolated abuse of power. This was the symptom of a protected pattern. Halvin exhaled slowly, jaw tightening. "Do you have the flight number and date?" Redden nodded. "I'll get it from my logbook." Without another word, the captain stepped into the cockpit and picked up the internal comm, muttering something to the ground ops. Darien couldn't hear the exact message, but he caught the words "mid-flight incident log" and "escalated conduct," which told him enough. A behavioral incident report was now active. Leron whimpered again. Darien rocked him gently, whispering soothing sounds, but he could feel the child's hunger setting in. Formula powder sat in the side pouch of his carry-on, but without the bottle and without warm water, it was useless. He looked down at his son's trusting eyes and vowed silently that today's injustice would not go unanswered. From the cabin behind them, the low buzz of angry murmuring grew louder. Merrick was trying to win back the crowd. "He handed it to me," he barked. "He said it was used. I was just protecting others. Sanitation comes first." But it wasn't working. One passenger near the front muttered, "Liar!" Another stood and walked toward the galley, stopping just behind Darien. It was Jaren Tyvek. "Captain," he called, "I saw the whole thing. That bottle wasn't handed over. It was snatched." Captain Halvin emerged again, nodding solemnly. "I've logged the incident with Ops. They'll be waiting when we land. Mr. Kelvin, I need you to stay seated up here for the remainder of the flight. You and your son will be the first to disembark. We'll ensure you're met properly." Darien gave a single nod. "Understood." Merrick's voice came louder now, bordering on unhinged. "This is ridiculous. He's manipulating everyone." No one responded. Silence had become its own verdict. Suddenly, Merrick tried to approach, pushing past a row of seated passengers, arm stretched out as though trying to reclaim some abstract authority. "You're creating a scene to avoid responsibility," he yelled. Captain Halvin's boots hit the cabin floor sharply as he intercepted him mid-aisle. "Mr. Doss," he said firmly, "you are ordered to remain at the rear of the aircraft. You are relieved of duty for the duration of this flight." Merrick froze, eyes darting between the captain, the passengers, and Darien. "You can't do that. You don't have the authority mid-air." But his voice faltered as more passengers stood, silent, immovable, undeniable. Phones were visible in hands. Red lights blinked. Evidence was everywhere. Darien said nothing, only pulled Leron closer to his chest, shielding him from the intensity with the quiet protection only a father could offer. Merrick's jaw clenched. He turned abruptly and returned to his jump seat, sitting stiffly, muttering under his breath. In the quiet that followed, Redden Corv returned with a thermos of warm water. "It's not much," he said, handing it to Darien, "but it's something." Darian accepted it with a grateful nod and began carefully mixing the emergency formula he always kept for worst-case scenarios. He had packed it hoping he'd never have to use it. Now it was the only thing standing between his child and a flight of hunger. Behind him, another male passenger approached, Hilar Dren, one of the quiet ones. "Mr. Kelvin," he said softly. "I heard Marek talking before the flight. He said something about people thinking they're above the rules. I think he was talking about you." Darian looked at him carefully. "You're sure?" Hilar nodded. "Pretty sure." He looked toward the gate while saying it. "You had just boarded with your son." It was confirmation, not just of misconduct but of intent. Captain Halvin's voice came calmly over the intercom a few minutes later. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the disruption earlier. The situation is under control. As always, your safety and comfort are our top priorities." The message wasn't just for the passengers, it was a signal that a line had been drawn. As the captain returned to the cockpit, Darian sat back holding Laurent, now feeding quietly from the makeshift bottle. Around him, the cabin slowly settled, though the energy had changed. There was no returning to normal, only moving forward toward accountability. He tightened his arm around his son and whispered, "Almost there." From the back, Marek Doss sat silent, no longer glaring, only waiting. The weight of consequences had finally begun to settle in. The more chaos rose around him, the clearer Darian's purpose became. Marek shoved his way past two standing passengers with an edge of desperation in his stride, his shoulder brushing roughly against one of them, causing a surprised grunt. He stopped short of Darian, who remained seated, cradling Laurent against his chest. The baby had just begun to drift into a light nap, but the sudden tension in the air jolted his eyes open. Without warning, Marek pointed a finger at Darian and raised his voice. "You're making a scene to avoid responsibility," he barked, his tone loud enough to jolt passengers in nearby rows. "Trying to twist what happened to cover your own failure." The accusation rang false, and Darian knew Marek was unraveling. He didn't flinch. He didn't even shift in his seat. Instead, he looked up slowly, his eyes level and calm. "You're escalating this, not me," he said with quiet firmness, his voice clear but devoid of anger. Laurent whimpered softly, disturbed by the noise. Marek's expression twitched. He expected retaliation. Instead, he received restraint, a man refusing to sink to chaos. That refusal made Marek seem more unhinged by comparison. The passengers, once uncertain, now leaned in, watching the unfolding confrontation with growing alarm. Some began reaching for their phones, quietly tapping record buttons. One man in a black jacket leaned into the aisle and whispered, "I've got this on camera," to the man beside him. Another simply nodded grimly. Darian stayed still, letting the outburst expose itself. His silence was not passivity, it was strategy. A trap Marek didn't realize he'd walked into. Captain Larrick Halvin returned at that moment, emerging from the cockpit like a man who had already made a difficult decision. His voice, low but commanding, cut through the tension. "Marek, step back, now." The shift in tone was unmistakable. Authority had shifted, and Marek hesitated. His mouth opened as if to argue, but no words came. His breath quickened. His eyes darted, calculating. The passenger's gaze, the captain's stance, Darian's composure, it all pressed inward. "I need to file a protocol report," Marek sputtered, gesturing vaguely toward the front of the plane. "This situation has breached sanitation and compliance." "There is no protocol that justifies what you did," Larrick interrupted, standing directly between Marek and Darian. "And you are not leaving your post to write anything." Then came the twist no one expected. "I saw him," a voice said quietly. Everyone turned. A man in the third row stood, tall and lean, dressed in plain slacks and a rumpled gray shirt. He cleared his throat. "I'm Terran Vos," he said. "Systems engineer. I wasn't going to get involved, but I saw the whole thing. Merrick stiffened. I watched him earlier, Taryn continued, pointing at Merrick. He pulled out a pair of rubber gloves from his uniform pocket before grabbing that bottle. It wasn't impulse. He knew exactly what he was doing. Gasps followed. Redden Corv, standing near the beverage cart, looked stunned. Merrick's eyes widened. That's not true, he said, his voice cracking. He's mistaken. You looked at the bottle 3 times before touching it, Taryn cut in, and you stared at it like it offended you. That wasn't sanitation. That was personal. Silence reigned for a long, charged second. Then murmurs rippled across the cabin, low but sharp. He planned it? Someone whispered. He brought gloves? Darian exhaled slowly, letting the truth settle. It wasn't about a bottle anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. This was something deeper, calculated, bitter, and unprofessional. Merrick had crossed a line that could no longer be denied. In a final act of defiance, Merrick turned and stormed toward the cockpit. I have a right to log this incident properly. But Larrick moved faster, stepping into Merrick's path with a voice like steel. You're done. You're not filing anything. Merrick froze. Behind him, the cabin watched with unblinking judgment. Redden moved forward slowly, his face pale. He stopped near Darian and leaned in with a whisper barely audible. Last year, there was another issue. Merrick tampered with the passenger's allergy medication. The report vanished from the system. Darian's brows furrowed. Vanished? Redden nodded. Someone erased it. But I remember. I was there. The final piece clicked. This wasn't about one bottle, one outburst, or even one flight. It was a pattern, hidden, protected, and now bleeding into the light. Darian's focus sharpened. He wasn't just a father defending his son anymore. He was a witness to a system failing to hold its own accountable, and now he had the leverage to change that. He adjusted Laron's blanket, still calm. Merrick remained rooted in place, breathing heavily, sweat pooling at his brow. Around him, passengers shook their heads or looked away, the verdict already delivered through silence. And as Darian looked past Merrick toward the exit row, a quiet determination settled over him. What began as a reckless act was now revealing a hidden history. The captain has made his decision, a voice rang out sharply, slicing through the tense silence. Captain Larrick Halvin stepped forward, his posture firm, expression unshaken. His eyes locked onto Merrick Doss with the weight of authority. You're being relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. A heavy pause followed. Merrick blinked, lips parting as if the words hadn't fully registered. His body stiffened and then, almost comically, he let out a strained laugh that died instantly in his throat. You don't have the authority to suspend me mid-air, he barked, voice rising with panic. That's not in protocol. The irony was immediate. Passengers across the cabin exchanged glances, many already aware that flight captains held final authority on board. Merrick's claim wasn't just false, it exposed how poorly he understood the very rules he had been weaponizing. Applause broke out from multiple rows, scattered at first, then growing into a confident chorus of support. The tension that had coiled tightly around the cabin snapped loose for a moment as relief swept through. Heads turned toward Darian, who remained motionless in his seat, Laron cradled against his chest. He had said nothing to provoke the decision. He had done nothing but remain still, steady, and clear. Merrick staggered backward, his mouth twitching as if trying to form a rebuttal, but there was none. The applause quieted, but the silence that followed was louder than any protest he could muster. He glanced toward the rear galley, searching for allies, but Redden Corv stood firm, arms crossed, eyes downcast, offering no rescue. Darian slowly stood up, his voice low and even. Would someone be able to bring some warm water? He asked. I have an emergency formula pack, but it won't mix unless I can warm it slightly. It's not ideal, but it's something. Redden moved instantly. "I'll get it," he said, vanishing down the aisle. Darian lowered his gaze to Laurent, whose tiny hands twitched in half-sleep. His own hands were steady, even as his mind remained alert. The worst had passed, but not the consequences. He could feel something more beginning, something bigger than just Merrick's behavior. The ripples were widening. Captain Lyric had not left the aisle. He now stepped aside and discreetly reached for the intercom handset. His voice, quiet but purposeful, carried to the cockpit. "Flight 772, priority relay to ground control. Passenger incident confirmed. Request investigators on arrival. Echo code 42. It was a coded phrase, routine for trained ears but ominous in weight. The foreshadowing was clear. This would not end with a conversation or a mid-flight apology. There would be scrutiny, review, consequences. At the rear, Merrick slumped into a vacant jump seat by the exit door, muttering to himself, rubbing his temples. He shook his head repeatedly, blinking as if waking from a nightmare that had somehow become real. "This isn't how it was supposed to go," he whispered, but no one was listening anymore. In the center of the cabin, quiet organization began. A tall man in a green windbreaker turned to the others in his row and spoke softly. "Let's make sure everything's documented. If they need statements later, we'll already be aligned." Another passenger, a young man with a braided bracelet, pulled out his phone and began compiling timestamps. Hilar Dren, a soft-spoken man who had remained quiet throughout the flight, finally stood and moved toward Darian. He leaned close and spoke with hesitation. "I don't know if this helps, but when Merrick boarded this morning, he was already tense. I overheard him muttering near the crew station. Something about passengers who think they're above rules." Darian's gaze sharpened. "Are you sure it was this morning? Not during the flight?" Hilar nodded. "Positive. I remember because I thought it was an odd thing to say before anyone had even boarded." That changed everything. The targeting hadn't been impulsive. It had been premeditated, formed before Darian even buckled his seatbelt. A slow realization dawned in Darian's mind. This wasn't a clash over protocol. It was a profile attack disguised as procedure. He nodded slowly. "Thank you. That detail matters more than you think." The captain's voice returned over the intercom, steady and composed. "Ladies and gentlemen, the situation has been addressed. We are continuing smoothly toward Varennes Port, and we thank you for your patience and cooperation. Safety and respect remain our highest priorities." In the renewed quiet, Darian sat back down, adjusting Laurent's blanket, his arms wrapped protectively around the infant's body. He could still hear Merrick breathing unevenly from the rear, less a man now, more a silhouette of failed control. The uniform no longer shielded him. Authority had shifted, and with it, the path forward became unmistakably clear. Darian's mind was already arranging the next steps. Witnesses, statements, official reports. He had come prepared for a meeting in Varennes Port, but this was a meeting with truth. He looked down at Laurent, now sleeping soundly despite the storm he had unknowingly weathered. A storm that had been met not with rage, but with clarity. Not with panic, but with purpose. The moment Merrick lost the uniform's protection, the truth finally stood unshielded. The moment Merrick Doss was officially relieved of duty, a dense hush fell over the cabin like the aftermath of a thunderclap. The flight was no longer in chaos, but the silence that replaced it felt even heavier. Merrick, pale and motionless near the rear jump seat, stared straight ahead, still processing what had happened. Meanwhile, Darian Kelvin moved slowly toward the front of the aircraft. Laurent nestled quietly against his chest, his infant son's small breath the only thing reminding him to stay steady. Captain Lyric Halvin gestured Darian into a front-row seat and spoke low but firm. "Stay up here for now. We'll handle it. He won't come near you again." Darian gave a nod, eyes sharp. He sank into the seat, carefully unzipping his side bag with one hand and pulling out his phone. His thumb hovered for just a moment before beginning to type, not in haste, but in method, each word a precise record. Time of incident, language used, passenger responses, crew reactions. His calm had not wavered since the bottle had vanished into that stainless steel toilet bowl, but his mind had shifted gears entirely. What Merrick had seen as a moment of dominance, Darian now recognized as the first crack in a much larger wall. A soft whimper from Laron pulled his attention for a second. The baby stirred in his arms, uncomfortable and mildly hungry, but not yet crying. Darian stroked the side of Laron's head gently, whispering, "We'll get through this, little one." He had no bottle left, no backup supply, but he had a small emergency formula packet in the bag, barely enough and no warm water to mix it with yet. He noted that, too. Lack of access to infant nutrition due to crew misconduct. Emergency packet remaining. A shadow fell across him. "Mind if I sit for a moment?" Terran Voss, the quiet engineer from earlier, lowered himself into the seat beside Darian. His voice stayed low. "I just wanted to tell you, I saw everything, from before it happened." Darian tilted his head, listening intently. "I noticed him, staring at the bottle, way before the argument, like he was offended by it." Terran hesitated. "He even pulled out a pair of gloves from his pocket before touching it. I thought it was strange then, but now it feels like it was planned." Darian's eyebrows lifted. "Gloves? Blue nitrile, standard kind. He slid them on just before he snatched it from you, like he was preparing to handle something contaminated. But the way he did it wasn't hygiene, it was performance." Darian nodded slowly. "Would you be willing to write that down? Or say it to investigators?" "I already did," Terran replied, producing a folded piece of paper from his back pocket. "In case they need a second copy. It's all there." Darian took it with gratitude, eyes scanning the neat technical handwriting. This was more than a witness. It was a puzzle piece. As Terran returned to his seat, Redden Korv, the second flight attendant, cautiously approached. His face was taut with regret. "Mr. Kelvin, I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I should have stepped in sooner." "You tried," Darian said, watching him carefully. Redden hesitated. "It's not the first time Merrick's gone overboard. 2 months ago, he almost got removed after yelling at a diabetic passenger for storing insulin incorrectly. Thing is, that complaint disappeared, got buried." Darian's eyes narrowed. "Buried by who?" "Supervisor named Corin Valst," Redden murmured. "He protects Merrick. Doesn't matter how many times passengers report him. It never shows up in the system. He's connected." Darian didn't reply at first. He only returned to his phone and added a new line. Possible internal pattern of suppression. Repeated incidents erased. Name: Corin Valst. Turbulence rippled through the aircraft briefly, causing a flicker of unease. But Darian barely noticed. He was already steps ahead. A few rows back, Merrick glanced toward the front. His eyes moved nervously across the faces that no longer trusted him. He was no longer crew, just another man on a plane who had gone too far. The dramatic irony was stark. Merrick still believed he might talk his way out of this, but Darian was already documenting the very systems that enabled him. Captain Larrick's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We will be arriving shortly. Please remain seated. Authorities and airline investigators will meet us at the gate. Thank you for your cooperation." Gasps and whispers spread like sparks through dry kindling. "Authorities?" a passenger repeated aloud. "They're meeting the plane?" Darian met eyes with Jaren Tyvek across the aisle, who gave him a subtle nod of support. Everything was moving now, momentum building not just toward landing, but toward justice. Darian checked Laron again and saw the baby had fallen into a light, restless sleep. He kissed the child's forehead softly, then whispered into the quiet between them. It's going to be all right. Outside the cabin windows, runway lights began to appear on the horizon. As the aircraft gently descended toward its destination, the passengers braced for landing, but Darien knew the real descent had already occurred, inside Merrick's authority, inside the system that had shielded him for too long. And with the ground rising fast, one truth became clear to everyone watching. A single, wrongful act had cracked open a hidden structure waiting to collapse. The attendant smirked, confident his mischief would go unpunished, unaware that every move, every witness, and every ounce of evidence had already been prepared for a counterattack. If you believe cruelty under a uniform always folds when strategy meets unstoppable justice, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The landing gear struck the runway with a jolt that echoed through the cabin like a gavel coming down on a verdict. It wasn't just the sound, it was the feeling, the sudden awareness that something decisive had happened, and there was no going back. The aircraft groaned slightly as it decelerated, metal and rubber gripping the concrete with a kind of reluctant finality. Every passenger felt the tension that still lingered in the pressurized air, and no one spoke as the plane veered off the main taxiway, guided toward a remote inspection bay far from the usual gates. Through the cabin windows, figures appeared, stern, uniformed men in navy blue Orline aviation oversight jackets, clipboards in hand, body cameras strapped to their chests, standing shoulder to shoulder like judges awaiting a hearing. Merrick Doss, seated alone near the rear exit, twitched in his seat. His leg bounced rapidly as he tried to steady his breathing, wiping a clammy palm against the side of his uniform. He leaned toward the window, catching sight of the approaching personnel, and for a moment the bravado that had fueled his earlier actions seemed to drain from his face. The intercom beeped. "We've arrived," Captain Larrick Halvin announced in a firm, measured voice. "We'll be met on the tarmac by oversight investigators. We ask all passengers to remain seated until instructed otherwise." The cabin was silent, save for the hum of engines powering down. The forward door hissed open. Darien Kelvon, holding Laurent against his chest, now asleep but still clinging instinctively to his shirt, was the first to rise. Larrick stood beside him, nodding silently before escorting him out of the aircraft. The two men descended the stairs and were met by investigator Renler Caed, a tall man with deep-set eyes and an expression that spoke of long hours, no nonsense, and an unwavering focus. "Mr. Kelvin," Renler greeted calmly, "we'll take your statement in a private room. Everything will be recorded. Thank you for your cooperation." Darien nodded once. His voice remained steady. "Let's make sure every detail is heard." Inside the makeshift investigation lounge, set up adjacent to the inspection bay, they were joined by 3 other male investigators. A water bottle was placed beside Darien, but he didn't touch it. His eyes never left Renler as he recounted the events with surgical precision, pausing only to clarify timelines and ensure accuracy. Every detail was backed by logic, every emotion controlled but unmistakably real. Back on the tarmac, Merrick was led out separately, his gait unsteady, his eyes scanning the surroundings as if searching for someone, anyone, who might still be on his side. But he saw no allies, only authority. He began explaining immediately, hands gesturing nervously. The passenger became aggressive. He refused to comply. "He pushed me," he stammered. Renler's assistant, investigator Jalen Trask, interrupted. "We've already reviewed several mid-flight witness reports and received real-time footage. You'll have a chance to respond, but we ask you to wait until formally questioned." Merrick hesitated, swallowed, and lowered his eyes. Meanwhile, Darien finished his statement. He opened his phone, displayed his notes, time-stamped details, and listed names of passengers willing to corroborate. Renler reviewed it with a raised brow, clearly impressed. "We've already received digital video submissions from at least 4 passengers," Renler added, "and Captain Halvin transmitted an in-flight incident report during descent. Mr. Doss's claim of aggressive behavior won't hold up." A quiet knock came at the door. Another officer entered and handed Rendler a folder. He opened it briefly, then looked back at Darien. "There's something else," he said. "Mr. Doss's personnel file shows several blank entry windows where complaints should be. We cross-checked the system, and it confirms that at least 2 prior misconduct reports were erased." He paused. "Your second attendant, Redden Corv, was right. Something's been buried." Darien's jaw tightened, but his words came evenly. "So, this wasn't the first time." Rendler shook his head. "It won't be ignored this time." The scene shifted quickly after that. Passengers began deboarding in small groups and were guided to a shaded tent area nearby. One by one, they offered to give statements, several producing phones with time-stamped footage. One man, Taryn Voss, the engineer who had earlier noted Merrick's rubber gloves, stepped forward again, handing over a detailed written account and confirming his testimony on camera. Another passenger, Heller Dren, added his own memory of Merrick muttering about passengers who think they're above rules, even before boarding had finished. Soon, the line of witnesses stretched beyond the tent. Investigators had to call in more staff from a nearby operations terminal to help collect evidence. Inside the lounge, Laurent stirred lightly. Darien adjusted the infant's blanket, bouncing gently on his knee until his son nestled back into sleep. For the first time, there was a sense of breath, of calm, not in the air, but within Darien himself. He had carried the storm with dignity, step by step, without breaking. Now, the weight was shifting off his shoulders. Rendler approached again. "We'll need to formally request the black box service logs to see if Merrick's supervisor intervened in previous disciplinary actions. His file is too clean for what we're seeing." Darien nodded. "I'm willing to give a formal statement under oath, if needed." "You might need to," Rendler said. "This is bigger than we expected." Outside, Merrick had grown pale, sitting on the edge of a transport crate with his hands shaking, his authority gone. Every excuse had shattered under the weight of facts. And inside, Darien held a sleeping child who would never remember the flight, but who had unknowingly been the reason truth came crashing down. The aircraft sat quietly in the background, its engines finally silent. But the echoes of what had happened on board reverberated through every spoken word, every step of accountability that followed. It was no longer a flight, it was a reckoning. The incident phase of the journey was complete, but its consequences were just beginning. Truth had landed with more force than the aircraft itself. The door clicked softly behind Officer Rendler Cade as he entered the quiet lounge. Darien didn't look up at first. Laurent, finally asleep, lay nestled against his father's chest, his tiny hand curled into the collar of Darien's blazer. The tension of the flight still lingered in Darien's body. Tight shoulders, a locked jaw, muscles held in silent alert. But he remained seated, steady, his eyes on the reflection in the dark window as the officer approached. Rendler didn't waste time. "He admitted it," he said, voice low but firm. "Merrick Doss confessed to flushing the bottle." Darien exhaled slowly, no surprise registering. "On what grounds?" He claimed it was due to a strict contamination rule. Darien turned his head slightly, his gaze finally settling on the investigator. "Did he cite a specific policy?" Rendler shook his head once. "When I asked him to provide the rule number or even a protocol reference, nothing. He stalled, stumbled, then said he couldn't recall." Dramatic irony flickered through the room. Merrick, the man who had shouted about procedure and accused a father of misconduct, could not even name the policy he claimed to uphold. What he thought was a shield had now become a spotlight, revealing not only arrogance but incompetence. Darien remained quiet, but his fingers moved slowly across the screen of his phone. Notes, timestamps, names, details, the weapon of a man who refused to be swept aside. Rendler watched him for a moment before clearing his throat. "There's more," he said, and now his voice carried the weight of a deeper revelation. During our internal file review, we found something unusual, a deleted entry, a report from last year involving Merrick and an elderly man's medical device, some sort of insulin monitor. Fragile. Allegedly, Merrick mishandled it during a baggage check and tried to blame the passenger, but the report was erased. Darian looked up sharply. Erased? Not resolved, not dismissed. Gone. Gone. Purged from the system, Rendler confirmed, nodding. It connects to the pattern we're beginning to see, complaints vanishing under the supervision of someone with clearance. And the same someone who covered this flight, I assume, Darian said, the line between question and statement blurring. Rendler didn't answer. He didn't need to. The lounge door opened again. Redden Corv stepped in, his posture stiff with guilt. He held a single envelope in his hand. Paper, not digital. A formal statement. Darian looked at him without judgment, only expectation. I should have done more, Redden said softly, crossing the room. I froze. I thought it would die down. But I saw what he did. All of it. And this time, I won't be silent. He placed the envelope on the table next to Darian's phone. It's all in there. His behavior, the things he said, and records I remember seeing months ago, the ones that aren't in the system anymore. Darian gave a small nod, one of silent approval. Not forgiveness, not yet, but acknowledgement. That means more than you think, he replied quietly. A few moments later, the quiet was broken again, this time by soft footsteps. One by one, male passengers who had been on Flight 772 entered the room, approaching Darian with words of quiet respect. You held it together. You kept calm. That made all the difference. If you hadn't said something when you did, who knows what might have happened? They each spoke briefly, not to crowd, but to affirm. Darian, still seated, accepted each handshake with quiet gratitude. Behind his eyes, the memory of Laurent crying, hungry, unsettled, and robbed of his only bottle, remained sharp. That pain was not forgotten, but in this moment it was transforming. Captain Larrick Halvin entered last. His voice cut through the remaining tension like a scalpel. Mr. Kelvon, I've recommended that our safety division launch a full review, not just Merrick's history, but every supervisor who handled, or mishandled, those complaint files, especially Corin Valst. The name landed like a quiet detonation. Darian's suspicion, foreshadowed in glimpses throughout the flight, now had form. A real figure behind the curtain, a gatekeeper who erased truth to preserve appearances. Thank you, Captain, Darian said, adjusting Laurent's blanket gently. I don't want an apology. I want correction. Larrick gave a firm nod, stepping back as Rendler Cod moved closer. We'll need your official testimony by tomorrow morning, Rendler said, but from what I've seen so far, and the evidence you've already gathered, he hesitated, then added, you're building something far more impactful than a complaint. You're building a case that could change our internal oversight structure permanently. Darian's face remained unreadable, but beneath the stillness, a quiet current of resolve moved like water beneath glass. He tapped the final line into his phone's notes, then pressed save. As the room emptied again and quiet returned, Darian leaned back slightly. Laurent shifted, still fast asleep, oblivious to the chain reaction his missing bottle had sparked. Outside, the lights of the airfield flickered through the window, casting long slanted shadows across the lounge floor. And in that flickering half-light, Darian realized that this moment wasn't the end of the confrontation. It was the start of something larger. A legal storm was forming, and truth had already begun dragging long-buried rot into the open. He didn't know what form the consequences would take. Not yet, but he knew the system was beginning to tremble, and he would not let up, not until everything that hid behind Merrick's actions was exposed. The truth had not only surfaced, It had begun unraveling everything around it. The door clicked shut behind Darian as he stepped into the starkly lit conference room, Laron resting quietly in his arms. The air was crisp and clinical, filtered, rehearsed, like everything inside the space had been scrubbed for appearances. 3 senior airline representatives rose from a sleek glass table as he entered, their uniforms pressed, ties sharp, shoes polished to a mirror sheen. But their faces, despite the surface calm, showed the fatigue of a long night and the anxiety of a public relations storm not yet contained. "Mr. Kelvin," one of them said, offering a stiff handshake. "We deeply regret the circumstances that led to this meeting." Darian nodded, his expression unreadable. He didn't sit yet. Instead, he adjusted Laron's position in his arm, steady and deliberate. "Go ahead," he said. "I'm listening." The man who had spoken first, tall, silver-haired, and with the badge of a regional director, cleared his throat. "First, on behalf of Aeroline Airways, I want to apologize for the incident involving Flight Attendant Merrick Doss. We understand this has been upsetting for you and your child, and it certainly does not reflect the values or training of our airline." There was a pause, the kind designed to invite forgiveness. Darian remained standing. Another representative, younger and more polished in tone, slid a small envelope across the table. "As a gesture of goodwill, we'd like to offer a full refund, accommodations for the next 2 days, and travel vouchers valid for any destination in our network. Business class, of course." Laron stirred gently, and Darian glanced down at him, brushing a thumb against the baby's sleeve. Then he looked up, meeting each man's eyes in turn. "Your gesture," he said, voice calm, "is noted, but I'm not here for vouchers. I'm here because someone flushed my son's only bottle mid-flight, then tried to lie about it." The silence that followed was brittle. The youngest of the 3 men shifted uncomfortably. The oldest clasped his hands tightly together on the table. "I'll be proceeding through official channels," Darian continued. "This isn't just about one flight. It's about a pattern, one you've ignored for too long." A slight intake of breath betrayed them. Just a flicker, but enough to confirm what he suspected. They weren't surprised by what he'd said. They were only surprised that someone like him wasn't intimidated. "We understand your concern, Mr. Kelvin," said the 3rd man, his voice low and composed. "But this was an isolated incident. We are handling it internally. Please allow our disciplinary systems to function." "Your systems," Darian interrupted, "shielded Merrick Doss through multiple incidents. You know it. I know it. And I have over a dozen witness statements and passenger video footage to back that up." The words cut through the air like a clean blade. None of the men spoke. For a moment, only Laron's soft breathing filled the room. Then, quietly, a 4th man who had remained silent until now, seated near the window with a closed leather folder, stood and walked to Darian's side. He was younger than the rest, his uniform badge reading Jarek Venlor, Internal Relations. "I'd like a word with you, privately," Jarek said, almost in a whisper. Darian hesitated, then nodded. They stepped out into a hallway where polished floors reflected overhead lights and the sound of distant foot traffic echoed like footsteps in an empty museum. Jarek folded his arms, glanced down the corridor, then leaned in slightly. "You're right," he said, "about the pattern. Marek wasn't protected by accident. Supervisor Corin Valst has been wiping complaints off the books for years, keeps incident numbers low, so upper management stays quiet. I've seen the edits myself." Darian's posture didn't change, but something sharpened in his eyes. "Why tell me this now?" "Because someone needs to stop him, and you're the first one who didn't let it go after landing." Jarek exhaled slowly, as though unburdening a weight that had sat far too long on his conscience. "Your case. It's airtight. You don't need to accept anything they're offering in that room. Keep pushing, and when it goes public, I'll testify." Darian offered a brief, steady nod. "Thank you." Back in the conference room, the atmosphere had shifted. The polished calm had cracked slightly. The representatives no longer looked like men offering solutions. They looked like men preparing for fallout. Darian didn't sit. He didn't need to. "I've heard what I needed to," he said. "You'll be hearing from my legal team." He turned to go, pausing only to glance over his shoulder. "And one more thing. If you think silence is your shield, it won't last long. The timeline's too clear. The footage too strong. The truth is already moving." None of the men responded. Outside the room, the hallway felt cooler. Passengers from Flight 772 passed him, nodding respectfully. Some stopped briefly to offer thanks again. Others simply offered a glance that spoke volumes. Trust, solidarity, gratitude. He stepped outside into the evening air where the sky had begun to dim. A gentle breeze swept across the airport walkway as Laren stirred lightly against his chest. The weight of the confrontation was real, but so was the progress. This wasn't about a bottle anymore. It was about the structures that had allowed it to happen. Darian had met their diplomacy with something stronger, truth, backed by composure and sealed with evidence. And in that, the balance had shifted. Promises spoken in fear cannot erase truths documented with clarity. The knock came just after dawn. A firm rap at the hotel room door jolted Darian Kelvon from a rare moment of peace. He moved swiftly, careful not to wake Laron, who was still asleep in the travel crib beside the window. The knock came again, and this time it was followed by a voice. "Oraline Aviation Investigations. Delivery for Mr. Kelvon." Darian opened the door to find a uniformed male investigator standing there, expression unreadable, holding a sealed envelope. "Formal notice from the airline," the man said. "Signed this morning." Darian nodded silently and accepted the envelope. As the door clicked shut, he stood in the quiet, breathing slowly. He opened the letter with deliberate care. Merrick Doss had been officially suspended, pending a full termination review. An internal audit was being launched to investigate all altered personnel files connected to his name. The tone was professional, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. It wasn't just about discipline. It was the beginning of exposure. Minutes later, his phone buzzed. Renler Cade's name flashed across the screen. "We've confirmed it," Renler said without greeting. His voice was direct but laced with something deeper, urgency, perhaps even vindication. "Corin Valst has been placed under immediate investigation. There's no question now. We found timestamps on the deletions. He covered for Merrick. Repeatedly." Darian exhaled quietly, watching the morning light spill across the room's carpet. "I had a feeling," he replied. The way Merrick acted, it was like someone had told him he was untouchable. Renler paused. He was, until now. Outside, the hotel's street was coming to life, but inside the room, time had slowed. Laron stirred slightly in his crib, rubbing his tiny fists against his face, and Darian walked over to gently adjust the blanket. Then came the ripple. Darian's inbox began to fill, first with one message, then 3, then dozens. Passengers from Flight 772 were reaching out. One sent a screenshot of a news alert. "Unnamed flight attendant suspended after infant safety incident." Another attached a video clip they had submitted to the press. The story was starting to break. The narrative was no longer confined to whispers inside an aircraft cabin, it was turning into public record. Merrick had tried to strike back. Renlor called again an hour later. "He's trying to claim emotional distress," he said dryly. "Said he was overwhelmed by passenger hostility." Darian raised an eyebrow. Did he forget there were 30 witnesses and 10 recording devices? "We didn't forget," Renler said. "We watched everything." His claim was dismissed immediately. Darian turned back to his laptop and resumed typing. Every detail from the flight, every contradiction Merrick had made, every statement offered by passengers and crew. He was building something careful, sharp, and irrefutable. The legal statement would leave no angle uncovered. Laurent babbled softly from the crib. Darian glanced over and smiled, the sound grounding him. His son had no idea the storm he had survived, no idea that a single moment, one flushed bottle had triggered a cascade that might change airline accountability nationwide. Another call came through. Redden Corv. His voice trembled slightly. "I just wanted to say, thank you. If you hadn't stayed calm, none of this would have come out." Darian didn't respond immediately. He could hear the weight behind those words. "I've been holding things in," Redden continued, "but now, other crew members, men I've worked with for years, they're stepping forward too. They're ready to testify. About Merrick, about Corin, everything that was covered up." Darian finally spoke, low and steady. "Then don't let this moment go. Make it count." "I will," Redden promised. "You have my written statement already, but I'll stand by it in court if needed." As the call ended, Darian leaned back in the chair. The weight hadn't lifted, but it had shifted. He was no longer carrying it alone. By late afternoon, his legal document was nearing completion. He reviewed it line by line, time-stamped moments, behavioral contradictions, the gloves noted by Terran Vos, the audio discrepancies, even the psychological profile emerging from Merrick's reactions. This wasn't just a story of an angry man on a plane. It was a record of how systemic negligence grows when no one holds the line. Outside, the sky darkened into evening. Laurent had fallen asleep again, his soft breathing the only sound in the room. Darian closed the laptop and placed it on the table. The draft saved, the evidence secured. From a single reckless act, a doorway to deeper truth had opened. Weeks later, Darian Kelvin stood beside the long glass window of a law firm conference room, watching the city blur behind the pane. The buzz of traffic below barely reached the room's thick carpet and polished table. Before him, neatly stacked on cream-colored paper, sat the finalized lawsuit, 12 pages of sharp, irrefutable truth. Each line, crafted with deliberate care, traced the arc of Flight 772's descent into chaos. It was more than a legal document now. It was the final response to a moment that had tried to silence calm with cruelty. "Page 9 outlines the supervisory negligence claim," said Malric Darren, lead counsel, his voice low but clear. He tapped the text with a silver pen. "Corin Valst's deletion of incident reports elevates this from internal misconduct to corporate negligence." Darian nodded slowly, eyes skimming the section. The name Valst seemed to glare back from the page like a smudge on polished glass. A man who had erased the pain of others with the stroke of a keyboard. He adjusted Laurent's baby monitor on the table beside him. It was silent now, the toddler peacefully napping back at the firm's daycare suite, unaware that his father was turning quiet hurt into lasting change. "We've also added affidavits from 9 passengers," Malric continued, passing another folder forward. "They voluntarily joined the case after hearing about the disciplinary updates. That brings undeniable strength to your side." A brief smile touched Darian's face, not from pride, but resolve. Each passenger had become a quiet pillar in the structure he was building, one of justice, not vengeance. Jaren Tyvek, Terran Vos. Even Redden Corv, the second attendant who had once hesitated, now stood firm with his testimony and moral clarity. "Any pushback?" Darian asked, his voice measured. "Some," Malric admitted, leaning back. "The airline tried to offer a non-disclosure settlement last week, substantial money in exchange for silence. They expected you to settle quietly." Darian gave a dry laugh that held no amusement. "They expected me to fold over a bottle." "No," Malric said. "They expected you to fold because you stayed calm. They underestimated what composure truly means." At that moment, the door opened and a junior associate entered with a crisp document in hand. "Statement just released, sir," he said, handing it to Malric. Malric skimmed it, then read aloud. Orlean Aviation confirms that Flight Attendant Merrick Doss has been officially terminated, and Supervisor Corin Valst has been removed from his position pending federal review. The airline has also enacted new protocols for infant passenger safety, initiated third-party oversight of crew behavior, and begun a full audit of personnel records. The room fell into stunned quiet for a moment. "They folded first," Darian said quietly. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Merrick had flushed away a bottle to assert control. Corin had deleted records to protect his numbers. But truth, quiet, documented, undeniable, had outlasted them both. Outside, clouds drifted across the late morning sky. The breeze nudged the trees lining the courthouse plaza below, peaceful yet persistent. Darian stood and gathered his papers into a leather briefcase, closing the latch with care. He turned to Malric. "Let's deliver it." As they exited the room, Darian paused at the threshold. From a seat by the window, he could just make out a father holding his baby on the sidewalk far below, bouncing him gently while waiting for a cab. A quiet echo of his own journey, months earlier, when all he'd wanted was a safe arrival. He stepped into the corridor, shoulders squared, the case folder under one arm, purpose guiding every step. He had dismantled something much larger than a single man's mistake. He had cracked open a system built on silence, and he had done it without ever raising his voice. Justice hadn't come with rage. It had arrived calmly, one documented truth at a time. Justice grows strongest in the hands of those who stay calm while uncovering truth. Seconds later, the father made him metaphorically swallow a lawsuit, exposing the act, freezing the crew, and enforcing accountability instantly. If you believe real authority acts decisively, with precision and unyielding force, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores negligence, abuse of authority, and the importance of protecting loved ones through the right channels. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage accountability, respect, and integrity in all situations.